on my computer as well. So you'll have the recording that comes up from Jess eventually. And also, if you ever want to ask for another version of the recording, I'll have it as well. So, hey everyone, thanks for coming out on this stormy day. It might actually have been really nice to not have to go out on this stormy day. Today, we're going to be talking about pest and disease management. And I wanted to take a really, really broad view of this topic to kind of equip you to understand what's really going on in your garden and why you might be seeing pest and disease problems. Because a lot of what we'll understand about this, it applies to ornamentals, it applies to edibles, it applies to everything. Some of the basic principles are actually really, really the same across plants in general. So today we will talk about what I like to call the perils of being a plant, or it's not easy being green, kind of an understanding of why plants have disease problems and pest problems in the first place. And that's actually has a lot to do with plant metabolism and our climate. We'll go through identifying abiotic versus biotic problems. So what's a problem that's just because of the environment and what's actually something that's caused by a pest or a disease, understanding diseases in general with the disease triangle, a little bit of insect ID, what I like to call who did this, and then how to help your plants in general. So kind of what we can do to set our plants up for success. So just as Jess always does their library intro, I always do my cooperative extension intro, right? You might not have heard of us. I know we have some master gardeners here, but there are folks who don't know about cooperative extension. So we're actually a nationwide network of researchers, educators, and volunteers. Here in Durham County, we are a partnership between North Carolina State University, North Carolina A&T, and the county and Durham County itself. So we receive support and funding from all three of those. Our office is located right downtown. We just put in another phase of our awesome demo garden. So come check us out. We have all sorts of different services. We have everything ranging from agriculture and horticulture, that's where I am, to family and consumer sciences. I like to think of this as everything you should have learned in home ec, but maybe didn't. So it's nutrition education, all sorts of adult services, everything kind of around that. We have 4-H, which is our kind of youth arm. Master gardeners, obviously, that's part of agriculture and horticulture. Welcome Baby, which does services for families with kids age 0 to 5, kids voting, which promotes civic literacy. We have workshops, classes, field days, tours. We do personal consultations through email, phone, a number of different ways. So we just provide a tremendous amount of service and support, and we're all about getting the resources of our universities out to people in a way that's practical and useful for them. A major way that you might interact with us as people who I suspect are interested in gardening is through the Master Gardeners. So this is a highly trained volunteer force that helps extend the work of our agriculture program here at Cooperative Extension. You can always email them your questions or thoughts or musings or anything like that at mastergardener@dconc.gov. That can be something as basic as, what is this bug? To what are some pollinator plants that might do well, or what's going on with my tomato? You can also call and stop in at our office Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4. If you want to check us out, if you want to try before you buy in terms of asking questions, I would encourage you to check out our blog, our Facebook, our Instagram. These social media accounts actually just won an International Search for Excellence Award, which is a big deal Master Gardener Award for their content. So these are really excellent. They have a lot of interesting tips and tricks and also kind of content from the region that you might find really interesting. And finally, if you just want to learn more about gardening in North Carolina, I absolutely encourage you to check out the Extension Gardener Handbook. This is a book that was put out by North Carolina State University. It was written by specialists and experts from all across the state. It's all entirely research-based. All the information we share is research-based. And it's amazing because it's gardening for North Carolina, right? So it's really catered to us. It's got a whole bunch of different chapters. I mean, it's like literally a textbook. It's phenomenal. It's got a chapter on everything you might be interested in, and it's written at a level that is kind of appropriate for someone who's getting interested in this, up to someone who maybe has some more background. So it's written for anyone. And you can buy a hard copy, but it's available entirely online for free too. So you can just check it out. I would absolutely say check this out if you're interested at all. So that's kind of my extension spiel. And now I want to get back to the main body of the talk, starting with, right, the perils of being a plant. So here in North Carolina, our plants often can struggle. Some of our native plants do better, definitely. That's absolutely true. But many of our plants, especially many of our edibles, right? So tomatoes, lettuces, anything, cool season, warm season, you name it, they struggle. And there's actually a metabolic and biological reason for this. And so as much as you and I might feel like, wait, why is my garden failing? Why is everything getting eaten? Why are there so many diseases? It's because we're fighting an uphill battle. And that has a lot to do with plant basic metabolic processes, including photosynthesis, transpiration, and respiration. I am the kind of person who, if things are failing terribly, I do find some solace in at least knowing why they're failing. And so I want to share that information with you because I think it will also help inform kind of how you think about your plants and how you think about problems when you see them. Because so often when we see a disease problem or a pest problem or anything like that, what we're actually seeing is a metabolic problem. So something is going on with that plant where it's not happy, it's not healthy. And so its defenses are down and it's easier to be attacked. And that's why we're seeing the disease or pest move in. So, all right, let's go back to high school biology. So thinking about why it matters, what's going on with the plant's metabolism. I like to think of it as how much money do you have in the bank? So you have a bank account, you have a checking account, it's got so much money in it. What can you do with it? You can spend it for immediate needs, right? Go out and buy dinner or that thing you want. You can save it for future needs. You can invest it for future dividends, or you can just give it away. It may not benefit you directly, but it does benefit someone else, which could still benefit, it's a whole social question, but right, there's still benefit there. Plants are exactly the same. They have, instead of having money, they have energy reserves, right? And so what do they do with that? They can, just like us, they can spend it. This is things like growth and defense, right? So, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with Zoom, but anyway, so this is things like growth and defense. So growing new leaves or putting energy into compounds that are going to help defend that plant against diseases and insects. They can save it for future growth. So this is going to be things like putting energy into your roots, putting energy into other storage structures so that you can come back later. Invest it, that's going to be seeds for future generations. And they can give it away. That'll be deers, bugs, slugs, gardeners, right? That's all how they give away their energy, right? So when you and I go to pick that wonderful, juicy tomato, that is a tremendous investment that the plant has put, right? It has created seeds, it's created all that fleshy structure, it's created all the liquid that's in the tomato, it's created all of that. And we're taking that, right? So we're taking all that energy. And just the same way as your bank account, where you can't both spend all your money and save all your money, right? You have to make a choice. Plants are the exact same way, right? Think of it as there's a finite amount of energy and they have to figure out kind of how to allocate that or how to put it out into all these different things. And if they spend all of their money, for example, giving it away, they can't grow well. Or if they spend all of their energy stored, then they can't invest for the future. And so how do plants make all of this energy that they have to make these decisions with? This is the high school biology part, right? So plants make energy through photosynthesis. This is where they use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar. This is a basic process, right? This is where almost all of our energy capture kind of in our land systems comes from. And the details of photosynthesis are not extremely important, but what I want you to notice is that what plants are doing is they're taking carbon dioxide and water and they're making it into sugar, right? And there's some oxygen that comes off too, but really they need carbon dioxide and they need water. And with sunlight, they can make sugar. And that sugar is the energy that we're talking about. They then use those sugars to build structures, survive, reproduce, right? That is the energy. That's what they do everything with. Just because I think it's an interesting sidebar, I do always like to mention that there are some plants that actually don't photosynthesize, even though we think of this as being a really plant thing, right? So this is Monotropa uniflora. It's a parasitic plant. You can always tell the parasitic plants because they are not green, right? Green is the color of photosynthesis because all of that action is happening in the green tissue. So this is a parasitic plant that actually grows often on beech tree roots. So it grows underground and it just flowers every once in a while. It's completely white. Because it's a parasite, which is cool. But so for most plants, what they're doing is they're taking carbon dioxide and water and they're creating sugar. And the way that they do that is that they actually literally have to be taking in carbon dioxide from the air, right? And they're taking it through their stomata, which are these tiny openings often on the underside of the leaf surface. And they look like little mouths, like they truly look like this, right? This is a picture of stomata. And so what the stomata do is they allow water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide to pass into and out of the leaf, right? So the cool thing about these stomata, though, is that they can open and close. So these guard cells, this is actually a pair of cells, they literally open up, and when they open up, carbon dioxide can flow in, water can flow in and out. And when they close up, the reason they do that is because then they don't lose water, right? So if it's really dry and if it's really hot, and if you're worried about losing too much water as a little plant, you can close up your stomata. You're not going to keep losing water, but you also can't take in carbon dioxide. Okay, so remember, you need carbon dioxide and water to create energy, but now you can no longer take in carbon dioxide if it's getting too hot out. So why does that matter? So right there are these three processes we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about photosynthesis, transpiration, and respiration. So transpiration is our second process. And so when the stomata are open and water is moving in and out of the plant, plants transpire. And this is basically the plant version of sweating, right? So water comes in through the roots, it moves up the plant, and then it flows out those stomata and it flows up and off of the plant. And this is just the same way as we sweat, right? So we get wet on the surface, that water evaporates, and then it helps cool us. So this is really, really useful if a plant is a little bit warm, right? If it's a little bit too hot, it can transpire, it can cool its tissue. Great. However, if it gets too hot, or if there's not enough water in the soil to supply the water that needs to sweat out or transpire out, the plants will close those stomata. And what that does is it makes it so that the plant doesn't just completely wilt, right? Because you can imagine if there's no water here, but the stomata are open, water will just keep pulling through, and eventually it will pull all the water out of the plant. So it's able to say, hey, there's no water here. I'm going to shut down up here. I'm going to stop this water movement. So again, we're starting to see a problem, right? When it gets really hot, when it's really stressful out, those stomata close, transpiration stops, photosynthesis stops because the carbon dioxide is not coming in. Sugar production stops, right? No more energy is being created. Just as a sidebar, just because it's kind of fun, a large oak tree can actually transpire almost 40,000 gallons per year. This is one of the reasons that forested areas are so much cooler than areas without a lot of tree cover, or like downtown where it's really, really concrete. It's because basically all these massive trees are literally sweating and helping to cool the entire surface of the land, which is just kind of like awesome and why we should have more urban trees. But transpiration is essential for cooling, and it shuts down when the plant gets too hot. So some of the other factors that influence photosynthesis: sunlight, right? Plants photosynthesize less on cloudy days, right? Because sunlight is really driving that reaction. Genetics: there are some plants that actually photosynthesize in a very different way. They time things very differently. A lot of our grasses and other desert plants do that. But for most of the plants that we're wanting to grow, it's all kind of standard. Temperature: the optimum range is 65 to 85 degrees. Above 85 degrees, which our summers often are, right? You have a lot of problems because those stomata close up to preserve water. Wilted plants also do not photosynthesize as well. And these are really the two down here that start causing us a lot of trouble where we are. So we have these really hot summers, even our nights are hot, and the plants have to close up those stomata. Otherwise, they're worried they're going to lose all their water. But when that happens, again, can't take in carbon dioxide. And so that's all about making energy. But what about spending energy? Plants do this through respiration. It's our last process we're going to talk about. So carbohydrates that are made through photosynthesis break down to release energy, and that energy release is what fuels growth, defense, and reproduction. So all of our major plant processes. It occurs in all cells. Respiration uses oxygen, and it occurs in both light and dark. So photosynthesis occurs predominantly in light, right? Because it's powered by sunlight, whereas respiration is running all the time. And this is where we start running into why I want to explain all of this to you and why I'm trying to kind of gently let you off the hook for why our plants struggle here, especially our non-native plants, which is most of our veggies. So photosynthesis makes energy, right? Respiration uses energy. Photosynthesis occurs only during the day. Respiration occurs all the time. Photosynthesis occurs only in cells that contain chlorophyll, only in green plant tissue, right? We looked at that parasitic plant that didn't photosynthesize at all, right? It had no green tissue. Respiration occurs in all cells. Photosynthesis is an optimum range of 65 to 85 degrees. Respiration increases with temperature. This is the trick, right? So with our warm nights especially, you have respiration occurring all the time. As it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, photosynthesis shuts down because the stomata have closed to preserve water. Respiration runs faster and it runs constantly, and it can basically start outstripping photosynthesis. So you are using more energy, you are spending more money than you're bringing in, right? And so especially if a plant has to be able to use all that energy for all these different things like defense and growth, but it's using it just trying to stay alive, right? The plants start failing. So this is kind of like that summer thing, right? Where all of our tomatoes start really flagging and we kind of just wonder what in the world's going on. And it's because of our hot summer nights, especially. There is no chance for the respiration rate to drop back down to less than the rate of photosynthesis. So in a perfect world, you want your nighttime temperatures 10 to 15 degrees cooler than your daytime temperatures. But we all know in the middle of summer, it almost like hits 85 and just stays there, right? It just stays. So some plants struggle here because they are simply not adapted to our climate. If you were to look at a USDA hardiness zone map, it's actually really interesting because we're really similar to some parts of Oregon that are like the most fertile, lush, green places you've ever seen in your life. We're not that, right? We might be the same hardiness zone, but we're not that. And the difference is that in those parts of Oregon, like coastal Oregon, they have cool nights. We have hot, humid nights, and it makes all the difference in the world. And it's because respiration is outpacing photosynthesis. So what happens here? We have a cash flow problem. We have little to no new growth, right? You can see you have this tip dieback up here on this. I assume it's a willow oak. You have all this tip dieback, and that's because basically the plant has started pulling its energy back towards the center because it simply can't support everything it needs to anymore. You can have little to no stored energy, and it affects future growth and resilience because as the plant has less and less and less energy to spend, it is going to cut back on defenses, it's going to cut back on growth, it's going to cut back on investment, so tomatoes, it's going to cut back on what it can give away. It can't invest anymore. So for example, tomatoes shut down when nighttime temps exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll see this often where in the hottest parts of the summer, you'll go out and look at your tomato plants and all the little flowers are just wilted. Part of that is because they can't even fertilize properly at that temperature. So they put out flowers, but they can't make fruit from that flower. Pollen of many crops loses viability over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's for even just a couple hours. So on days where we might hit 100 degrees, any pollen that should have been pollinating, your tomatoes, your peppers, anything else like that, it just dies. So, right, that crop of flowers is going to be lost and that crop of fruit is going to be lost. You have few or no flower buds formed because the plants simply don't have the energy for it. That's a pain in the butt when it's for this year's flowers, but it's frustrating because it can even infect next year's flowers. So for plants like some hydrangeas, camellias, other things like that, where they set flowers actually the prior year, if it was too hot when they were trying to do that, you're just not going to have flowers. Plants can't invest, so they're less able to defend themselves against insects and diseases. Stress plants actually also attract pheromones that attract pests. So aphids and other things like that are really, really smart. They have figured out what a stressed plant smells like, right? And so they're drawn in by that. Insects often reproduce more rapidly on stressed plants as well. It's part of their adaptation, right? So when the eating's good, they know to move even faster. This is kind of a fun prologue to what we're going to see later. So these are regular aphids. This aphid has actually been parasitized by a tiny wasp. That's why it looks so different and so weird. And so what happens is this plant starts getting stressed and it starts emitting all these stress hormones. And then the aphids come in because of those stress hormones. But then the aphids emit their own little stink too, right? So they have their own hormones that they emit. And as they emit more and more hormones, their predators can identify that, right? And so that's when you get the parasites and the ladybugs and everything else coming in because the aphids are at a critical mass. And so there is this whole intricate chain that should be happening here, but we often as gardeners freak out when we see the aphids, and that's kind of, we stop the chain right there. At higher temperatures, they also have nothing to give away, right? So with our vegetable crops, what we're really asking them to do is we're asking them to perform so well that they have extra to give away. They have tomatoes, they have peppers, they have squash, they have okra, just to give away, right? Not that they need for survival, but for us to take. But when, again, you're running out of energy, you're not going to do that anymore. This can be really frustrating for the edible crops. What does this have to do with us here, specifically in the Piedmont? Part of the trouble is that we have a number of local climate challenges, right? You guys have all seen this. And as climate change happens, these are only getting worse. So we have wind in the spring and the fall. If you've ever sweat on a windy day, you know, you can get cold, basically. Like it can be almost too effective, right? So that can be a problem. You can take off too much water. We can have erratic winter temperatures that are really hard for plants to predict. We have a lot more drought than we used to. It used to be that North Carolina in the Piedmont, our rainfall was relatively evenly spaced, but now we get basically the same amount of rainfall annually, but we get it in bigger batches. So we get a tremendous amount of rain, and then we have a drought, and then we have a tremendous amount of rain, and then we have a drought. Heat waves can be especially problematic, hot nights, and high humidity. So we're always just fighting an uphill battle. And I'm saying all of this to say really, it's hard here. And for a lot of vegetable gardens in particular, we're not trying to get the plants to live forever, to look good forever. That's actually just really not a realistic goal. What your goal can be instead is to have plants that are healthy enough that they provide a crop while they can, and that you then on the back end, right, have kind of the tough stuff that you need to pull those plants out when they're not quite dead yet, but you can tell they're well on their way. And so instead to move on to the next crop, right? Because plants here, our tomatoes don't die of old age, they die of disease. That's just the way it goes. And sometimes we have good years and sometimes we have really bad years, but disease will typically start taking those plants down, and you're better served taking them out and planting something else, right? Because typically the time that they start failing for warm season crops is right around the time that you should be planting cool season crops. And our cool season crops start failing right around the time you should be planting warm season crops, right? So the schedule actually works really well. It's just a lot of us are not quite heartless enough to take the plants out when we should. And this really gets to kind of this broader question of the types of problems. And so we're going to work through this a little bit more, but there are two major types of problems that you can run into in your garden. You have abiotic problems, which are non-living. These are those things that are caused by environmental or cultural conditions, right? A lot of what we've been talking about. And then you have the biotic or living problems. So these are caused by a pathogenic organism, right? So fungi, bacteria, viruses, insects, nematodes, deer, kind of all of that kind of stuff. And so we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about some of our abiotic problems that we can run into. But after that, we'll transition into biotic problems. But it's really, really important to understand that typically, even if you see a biotic problem, right, a disease, a pest, it is because the plant did not have the energy it needed to defend itself, probably because of an abiotic problem, right? Just like you and me, right? If I'm feeling run down and I'm stressed and I'm not eating well, I am more likely to get a cold. It's not because stress makes a cold. It's because I'm constantly surrounded by little cold viruses. And the moment I'm weakened, they know and they move in, right? And they're able to take over. So if your plant is weak for one reason or another, you're much more likely to get this. So it's really important to understand the abiotic things that could be stressing your plant out. So we know that temperature, we know that hot summer nights are always going to stress our plant, but there are other things too that can bring them down, and other things that we have a little bit more control over. One of the major things we do actually have some degree of control over is our soil. So we'll do that soil talk, like Jess mentioned, in September, but I don't know if Jess has ever seen me give a talk where I didn't talk about soil for at least a second, because it's very important. So our ideal soil makeup for most of our garden is going to be something like this. And it's what I like to think of as a mixture of space and stuff. So we have all of our little soil particles down here. It's about 45% mineral and about 5% organic. But then between all those soil particles, there's actually a lot of space. It's about half space by volume, right? So if I were to dig up like a cube of perfect soil, it would be half just open space in between those particles. And in that, we would really like to see about half of it filled with water and half of it left open for air, because plant roots do need to breathe. However, we have heavy clay soils here. And so what actually typically happens is that I've seen it before, and I think the typical Piedmont soil is something like 80% stuff, 20% space. The mineral component is clay, and it's really heavy and it's really compacted. You know, we've all seen this before, where we have soils that basically, once they get wet, they stay forever. And then once they dry out, we can't get them wet again, right? Like they're really finicky, and that's all that clay. But the really, really great thing about the clay is that if we think back to what plants are doing, that there are these producers that are using sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, they actually don't just need water and carbohydrate or water and carbon dioxide to do that, right? They need a whole bunch of other nutrients. And that's how they build their little plant bodies and all their other structures. And some of the primary nutrients that they need are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and then nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the three that you'll see on a fertilizer bag, right? So nitrogen is really, really good for green leafy growth. Phosphorus is really good for what we like to think of as roots and fruits and flowers. And potassium is really good for overall plant health. And so these three plants can get from the environment and even the air, whereas these three come from the soil. And so what's really important about these elements is that even though a plant really, really needs these nutrients and they're absolutely vital for healthy plant growth, one of the interesting things is that the soil pH is what really affects that nutrient availability. So let me talk you through this for a second. So this is a chart, and it shows a number of elements that are really essential for plant growth. And then it shows pH down here along the bottom. And so if a bar is red, it means that, for example, molybdenum is really not available. See this red section under 5.5. Between 5.5 and we'll say 8.5, molybdenum is available. Above 8.5, it's like very available, right? So this is kind of like not kind of really available. And so what's fascinating about that is you can see that actually pH has a tremendous effect on whether a nutrient is available to a plant. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I'm down here where our soils are natively, right around 5, and I think about something like potassium or phosphorus, okay? These are both some of our essential plant nutrients, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all here at the top. Down here at 5, a large number of plants, you could be dumping that nutrient on until you were blue in the face, but the pH isn't right, so the plant just can't see it, right? If the pH isn't right, the plant can't see it, it can't access it, it has a hard time using it. Whereas if instead you take your pH up here, so somewhere around 6.5, all of a sudden you've got a lot of greens and yellows. It's not perfect, but it's absolutely workable, it's absolutely doable. And you'll see that on average, a lot of plants do really like this space kind of between like 6.3 and 6.9, so just under 7. They really like that sort of soil pH, and it's because all these nutrients are available. As a sidebar, I will say that it's one of the reasons it can often be good to plant native plants that are adapted to our acidic soils, because if you look at a lot of native plants, things like blueberries and even some of our azaleas, they actually really like this sort of pH, and their little graph would look totally different, right? It would be green down here. And they also are a little bit more adapted to dealing with kind of like what I consider hard scrabble conditions where they don't have as much nutrients. But if you're thinking about a vegetable garden, which I know a lot of us are, those are not native plants, and they need to be somewhere in that 6.5 range. This is important because many nutrient deficiencies have similar symptoms that can even look like other problems. So if you start reading about what these nutrient deficiencies look like, a lot of time it's yellowing, stunted growth, dieback, wilt, like not wilt, but yellowing, stunted growth, dieback, all those sorts of things. And so it's really important to understand what's actually going on with your soil, because you might have all this yellowing and you're going out and, you know, applying whatever chemical or whatever it is, but you don't understand, well, maybe you just have a nitrogen deficiency, right? And so there are a couple of really basic things you can do to make your soil better. They don't necessarily affect your pH. We'll talk about that in a second, but they kind of help with overall plant health. The right amount of compost, right? Remember we talked about how you have 5% compost. If you fill a garden bed entirely with compost, that can be bad too. Compost does funny things. It is best friends with mineral matter. It's best friends with clay. It doesn't like to hang out by itself. It doesn't behave well. The other thing you can do is you can have always keeping living roots in your soil. So if you're doing vegetable beds, even when you're not planting vegetables, having a cover crop, in the winter, it could be something like crimson clover or vetch. In the summer, there's a number of good cover crops as well. This is really essential because in addition to all the things we've talked about with nutrients and pH, there's all these living microbes in the soil. And when you have living roots, they actually give off sugars that feed the microbes. The microbes are actually a lot of what's breaking down your nutrients and making them available. So everything works better if you have living roots in your soil all the time, if you keep your soil covered all the time. If you want to go ahead and figure out what's going on with your soil, and I would absolutely always recommend this, the best way to do that, to really understand it, is to do a soil test. I'm not going to give my full soil test spiel today because I would actually really encourage you to stop by our office, check out our website, go to the blue cabinet on the north side of our office at 721 Foster Street, and pick up some soil sample supplies and talk to us about it. I can put a link in the chat at the break too for kind of an overview of this, but basically we have all these cool soil sample supplies. And what we do is between April 1st and Thanksgiving, you can submit soil samples for free in these fancy little boxes. You can fill out your little form and we'll even check it for you. And we'll take it over to the lab in Raleigh for you. And they will tell you both your pH and what nutrients you need to add for the plants you want to grow. If you think you're having problems in your garden and you have not done a soil test, I'd be like, start there, right? Start there. Because again, remember, so many diseases, so many pests start with unhealthy plants. And if you're trying to grow a plant that wants a pH of 6.5 in soil that's 5, pH is a log scale. So those numbers are actually really, really, really far apart, right? And you could add nutrients in forever and ever, and the plants might not be able to access them. So you want to get your pH right. You want to get your nutrients right. If you do that, you add a little bit of compost, your soil will be better. And as many farmers know, they are not actually trying to grow plants. They're trying to grow soil, right? Healthy soil makes healthy plants. So it's worth really digging into that, pun intended, first, because that's what will help your plants the most. So we've spent a lot of time talking about some of the abiotic causes that you can have for problems. A lot of what you'll see with abiotic problems are things like yellowing, stunted growth, failure to thrive. What I love that it's referred to as an unthrifty appearance, right? So a plant that just kind of looks a little bit sprawled out, it's not doing well, it just doesn't look good, right? That's a lot of what you'll see. But sometimes you'll even see some pretty wild stuff that you might think is caused by a disease or a pest, but it's just caused by the environment. So throughout this, I'll use tomatoes as examples for a number of things, just because, as Jess and I were talking about at the beginning, tomatoes are total divas, and they show examples of basically every disease and problem you could possibly imagine. So why not? So this is a common one, physiological leaf curl. This is an abiotic disorder of tomatoes where you'll look out and all the leaves will be really curled up. The leaves actually are nice. I have another screen over here. Sorry. The leaves are actually nice and well formed. They're just curled. If the leaves are not well formed, just send me an email. We'll talk about that. But the leaves are nice and well formed. They're just curled. This is just a tomato saying that it's like slightly miffed about something, its environment. And you could ask it all day what it was, and it would never tell you. That's all it's doing, right? And some varieties are more prone to this than others. No concern really at all. It's just slightly miffed about something. Blossom end rot. So you'll see this a lot of times on the tomatoes where the blossom end, so the end opposite where the tomato is attached to the stem, just rots out and turns black. You will often hear this described as a calcium problem. It's actually typically not per se a calcium problem. Calcium is a mobile nutrient. It moves with water. We typically have decent calcium in our soils here. What happened here, though, is kind of erratic watering. Like maybe someone watered a lot one day and then they didn't water for a week, and then they watered a lot where they just were forgetting to water. And so then that calcium can't move because the water's not there to move it. Blossom drop, again, we talked about this. This is often a if you have a daytime temperature above 85 degrees, or if you have a nighttime temperature even above 70 degrees, you can get this to happen. Cat facing can happen when you have really cool nights, right? So it's all that black in there. Fruit cracking can happen often when the tomato was developing and it was near ripe, and then there was a heavy rain causing water uptake and the whole thing swelled, right? So these all might look like diseases, or you might be worried even that there was a nutrient problem, right? But like it could be temperature, it can be any number of different things. This is one of the reasons that, you know, my position is paid for partially through your tax dollars. The master gardeners are paid for as part of my program, right? And so we are here to help you. We are here to help you figure all of this out. It can be pretty confusing until you start seeing enough of it that you start developing kind of your own idea of how to process things. So if you have questions, always reach out to us, because if you were to go ahead and apply some sort of pesticide when you were having these problems, you wouldn't do anything, and you'd be applying a pesticide that wasn't, like, it wouldn't help you and it could hurt other things. So what are some of the major distinctions you can look for between abiotic and biotic problems? We're going to go through this, and then we're going to actually go ahead and take our break. I can answer some questions then, but we'll take maybe like 5 whatever-ish minute break, just you decide. So, okay, so abiotic problems. Abiotic disorders, they tend to appear very suddenly. So one of my like favorite examples is, right, that you look out in the lawn and all of a sudden, you know, there's a hard, jagged, weird brown line through the lawn, and it happened overnight. Somebody probably spilled something, or somebody probably dragged something through the lawn, or somebody probably did something like that, right? Whereas biotic diseases, they're diseases. They take time to develop and they appear gradually. Abiotic disorders affect many species. We looked at examples from tomatoes that wouldn't have affected other plants nearby, but oftentimes if you see a tomato plant and a pea plant and a mustard plant, you wouldn't be growing those all at the same time. A tomato plant and a pea plant and a corn, you know, all flagging at the same time, that's an abiotic problem. That's something with the soil or with the climate or with the water, something else that's going on, right? Because most diseases really affect only one or very closely related species. This is true for insects too. They tend to impact a very small, narrow range. I would not expect to look out in the landscape and see something that hit both a pine tree and a redbud. If I saw a pine tree and a redbud both having trouble, it's an abiotic problem. Abiotic disorders don't spread, right? So the problem will come in, it will impact, right? So that would be something like someone spilling a chemical, spilling salt, a spot being way too hot because of concrete nearby, whatever it might be. It would impact that area, but it wouldn't spread out, whereas a biotic disease would spread. Abiotic disorders are often geometric or linear patterns. So that's that example, right, of the hose left in the lawn, right? And it kills the little spot underneath it because it was there for too long. Someone accidentally forgot it out there for 2 weeks, right? That's going to be a line, and it's going to be very kind of clear, and you're going to see it, right? So that if you see a clear pattern, that's typically a human impact. Whereas biotic diseases are often spread by wind, or they're spread by birds, or they're spread by animals, or spread by whatever, right? But you're going to see these more random hotspot patterns. And finally, often with abiotic disorders, there's a distinct separation between healthy and non-healthy tissues. Again, right, the lawn is dead under the hose, or it is perfectly happy next to where the hose was, right? The lawn is dead where the chemical spilled, or it is perfectly happy where the chemical did not reach, right? Whereas with biotic diseases, because what you actually have is you have a fungus or a bacteria or something like that that's hit a center and is now spreading out, you'll see a halo and you'll see it kind of moving out, and it'll be a jagged edge. And you'll see kind of this careful space between diseased and undiseased. Lacking a clear sign of a pathogen, I would always assume I have an abiotic disorder. I would always assume that the underlying problem is that the plant is not happy, it's not healthy, it doesn't have the energy it needs to spend or to save or to grow. And because of that, maybe a biotic disease is coming in, but I need to fix this underlying abiotic or cultural problem first, right? I need to fix my soil. I need to add nutrients. I need to be better about watering. I need to move the plant, maybe, right? Maybe it's not getting the right amount of sun. And that will typically help cure a lot of the disease and pest problems that we're about to go over in the second half of this talk. So with that, Jess.
Yay. Thank you so much. I've already learned a lot, and I appreciate going back to high school biology.
Biology 101.
We've got a few questions. So, first, the question is, what does it mean by set? This is going back to sort of when you were talking about what does it mean to set the buds for the next year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And always always like stop me or ask questions in the chat.
Okay.
Or in the Q&A. Oh no, I mean in general, like no dumb questions, you guys. I use words and then I'm like, oh yeah. So when I mean set the buds is like, so if you think about something like an azalea, just because we're thinking about azaleas right now. So they just got done blooming, right? Their show is basically nearing the end. What they're going to do is all those flowers are going to die off, and then they're what we're going to call set buds. And what I mean by that is they're going to create the flower buds that will develop into flowers next year, but they're going to set or create those buds this year. So they're actually going to start setting their buds late summer, fall. So this is like another classic abiotic problem. What happens is that someone is just moved in, or they're excited about their azaleas or whatever it is. They just get like a fit of frenzy, right? And they go out and they prune the azaleas in early spring. They created those flower buds all the previous summer, fall. So if you go out and you prune that azalea in the early spring, you're going to prune off all those buds. And so it's helpful, especially with some of our ornamental plants, to know when they actually create or set their flower buds, because if you prune at the wrong time, you can just prune it all off and then you're going to have no bloom the next year.
Great. And then another helpful soil question, was like, it is the basis of everything.
It is.
For raised beds, what's the best time of year to add compost? Does it matter if you soil test first and then add compost later?
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question. Okay. So I'm like excited. So you can always add compost. Like when in doubt, add compost for the most part. The reason I have a little asterisk, or the reason I have a little for the most part, is because if you start getting to a situation where your bed is like 50 to 75% compost because you've been adding compost for years and you never added any like topsoil, it'll start acting funny, but most of us are not in that situation. You can always add compost. A lot of times I even recommend mulching with a thin layer of compost, right? So you'd plant all your plants and then you might put an inch of compost down on top to help protect your soil. When you submit your soil test, what the lab actually does is they burn off all the organic matter first. Step one. They do that because they're testing the mineral component. And so it doesn't super matter, when you add compost relative to when you submit your soil test, because the difference is that the lab is interested in the mineral component, which adds nutrients. Compost actually adds basically no nutrients in most cases. Compost is not a fertilizer. It doesn't add nutrients. Compost you can think of as like the plate. Nutrients are the food, right? You have to have the plate to effectively eat the food, but it doesn't mean you're going to eat your plate, right? So you add that compost and it holds the nutrients, it holds water well, it does all these cool things, but it's not the same as fertilizing.
Okay. And just to follow up on that, I'm going to skip to Rachel's question in the chat, which is what is the best time to add topsoil to raised beds?
So if you already have a bunch of stuff planted, it can be a little bit hard to add topsoil just for like logistical reasons. You don't want to bury your little plants that you just planted. But I would say add it whenever. If add it whenever is practical for you, add it whenever it makes sense. I typically, this time of year, right before I put my kind of warm season crops in, I top off with topsoil and compost, because how the raised bed is always, its level is always dropping, right? The soil is somehow always magically disappearing. That's because we have so many microbes in our soil and we have this hot humid climate and the microbes are always like partying and they're just eating your compost, which is great in some ways, but also means you're constantly topping off. I would say just do it before you put your plants in. If you can't do it, then you can always kind of dress around the plants. Just make sure you don't bury everyone.
Okay, so I think we've got like 3 questions around the same topic, kind of. So, yeah. What does it mean that plants can't access or recognize added nutrients due to their pH? Like,
I have been asked this before, and I feel okay. So pH. So what is the pH? Is kind of the question at the end there. pH, I'm not a chemist, and you guys are about to really see the limits of my chemistry knowledge, because it makes me nervous. So anyway, so pH is really all about how acidic or basic a soil is, or any substances. I think it really gets down to like a lot to do with hydrogen and what hydrogen's doing. And I really think you should Google it more if you want to know more than that, because yes, the relative amount of free hydrogen and hydroxyl ions in water. Go with God if that's what you want to learn more about. But so it's really all about how acidic or basic something is. And what's happening is I don't really understand the full chemistry of it, and I'm completely willing to admit that. But there are all these different nutrients, and we think of them as things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, molybdenum, but they're not. They are elements that are moving between all of these different compounds and all of these different structures based on the pH, right? So if there's a low pH, they might be in one form. If there's a high pH, they might be in a totally different form just because of how they're interacting with everything around them. And what's going on is that pH that's pretty close to neutral, just below neutral, something like a 6.5, they are in a form that the plants can access. Whereas when the pH is really high or when the pH is really low, they're going to move into a different form. Remember everyone, those horrifying moments in chemistry class where they would be like, balance this reaction, add a bunch of hydrogen. What happens now to the reaction? And you're like, please stop looking at me. I can't do this on a board. So that's all that's happening there, right? Is right around neutral. Everything's in a form that's pretty accessible. Some of the plants that have adapted to live in very acidic or very basic soils, part of their adaptation is really that they are able to recognize or access nutrients that are in different forms than they would be at the more neutral form. But so anyway, that was very long, convoluted. I can talk about it more. I think most people don't want that.
So, you said, someone asked about when to add compost and soil testing, and then someone followed up, but doesn't compost affect pH, and wouldn't that impact the soil results?
Compost can affect pH. It doesn't affect it that much. And again, the way the lab is testing, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture's agronomy lab is testing, and how they're testing, they actually do burn off all of that organic matter first. So they're basically forcing all of these nutrients into a form that is not the form that it would have with organic matter around it, because that's what their lab can test for. And then they can do all sorts of fancy math and calculations on the back end to figure out what that actually means for you.
Yeah, highly recommend soil testing. Okay, quick, before we move on to like a bug question, any recommendations for where to buy compost locally?
I'm a government employee, so I can't really tell you, but what I will tell you, I do like to buy compost in bulk when I can. It's cheaper than buying it bagged. I have a small pickup truck, so that works for me. It doesn't work for everyone. The benefits to buying bagged compost is that in past years, and this is a pile of worms, you guys, if you want to talk to me more about this, we can do this. But in past years, there have been problems with contamination in some compost, especially some bulk compost in the area. And so people have had trouble with that. I haven't seen the contamination creeping up as much with bagged compost, so that can be a benefit of bagged compost. If you ever get bulk compost and it is contaminated, know that that contamination actually breaks down over the course of a year through sunlight and microbial activity. So as heartbreaking as it is when it happens, it will only affect you for a year.
Yeah, and since we're government employees, we can't necessarily recommend anything specific. If folks have recommendations, please, you can put them in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys can just say whatever you want.
Yeah. Does an aphid infestation indicate a soil problem?
Aphid infestations are, I just put a link in the chat about soil testing if you guys want more. But aphid infestations are really, really interesting because I might have just sent it to Jess. Just resolve that, please. I did that now that I look at it. I only see aphids on stressed plants. So a lot of times, if I've been growing something in a greenhouse and it's like stressed because it doesn't like the greenhouse, I'll get aphids. So it absolutely could mean a soil problem. It could mean a water problem. Aphids are an indicator of a stress problem more broadly. If you kind of fix some of the other issues, if you added some compost, if you did a soil test, if you could do that, you started watering a little bit better, that would take care of those aphids. The other thing that can really help too is that aphids are delightful in that they can literally just be sprayed off with a hard hit from the hose. Or you can use something like insecticidal soap, which is an organic pesticide option that we'll talk about in the second half of the talk, because they're soft-bodied insects. They're just like super easy to kill. So they're annoying, but they typically indicate stress and they're easy to take care of.
And then last question before we take a break. Will you be sharing this video presentation with us? The answer is yes. Eventually, we will. We will. Yes, you will get a link. It might take some time, but we will follow up with the slides, with the link, and with any links that we share. Sorry, slides, link to the video, and any links that we shared during the presentation. So we're exactly at 11 o'clock. So let's move. Let's see. Let's just come back in 5 minutes. So 11:05. Take a little break, and then we'll be back for some strategies, I believe. Ashley, we should talk about getting some soil tests over at the library, maybe. So like we keep forgetting.
I love it. That's our white whale, isn't it?
Yeah. But if, I could come pick up a bunch of boxes and distribute them to all the library locations also. So
Holy mackerel. We could print you all the things.
Yeah. When's a good time for me to touch base with you on that?
Here's what I'll do is when we get stuff set up with Sarah, I'll just bring, because I'll be heading over, I'll bring all the things. Like, how many would you want?
Perfect. Gosh, I don't know. I mean,
a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just try to bring a lot.
Okay, let's get started. And it's the time of the presentation where my cat is losing it behind me. So I'm gonna go away and let Ashley continue. So I'm gonna resume the recording, and welcome to part 2, where we get into the nitty-gritty of it.
All right, everyone, so we're back. So in this second part, we're going to be talking about biotic problems. We're going to be talking about what you can do. Again, this is a super broad topic. And so I'll be illustrating some stuff with tomatoes again, just to kind of show you, and we'll be talking about a lot of different things. But what I'm really trying to show you is that there's some basic steps you can take for almost everything. And also, if your plants are healthy, that's the absolute best defense you can do. So typically when I see a disease or a pest problem crop up, I take that as an indication of an unhealthy plant, even more than like a symptom I need to treat, right? Like I need to figure out the underlying cause, which is why is the plant not healthy? So, all right, biotic problems. This is going to be, we're going to start with diseases, and then we're going to move into insects. So biotic problems are typically restricted to certain hosts. That's because most of our diseases and pests are adapted to only attack certain things. The symptoms tend to appear slowly and get progressively worse, right? So like each one of these little spots started as a spot even smaller than that. And then this was probably like 1, 2, maybe 3 spots that are slowly running into each other. But it started small and it started getting worse. The transition zone between healthy and unhealthy tissue is absolutely evident, right? So here you can see this is actually dead. This is actually the growing edge where the fungus is actively growing, right? And then you can also see that it's starting to impact some of this tissue around here. We're seeing the yellowing. And they can survive season to season in plant tissues, the soil, and in other protective bodies. It's one of the reasons it's basically like you're never going to get away from disease. So many of these things, just in the same way that seeds are the protective phase of the plant, where they're very, very well defended and they're very hard to get rid of. A lot of our fungus and bacteria have spores or other spore-like phases where they're super well defended. They hang out in the soil. That's just what they do, right? Like you have a lot of things you're trying to do in your life. A fungus is just trying to infect a plant. Like that's its goal, day and night, every day. So they will find a way to get back on. They will find a way to reinfect plants, and especially plants that are not healthy. One thing that can be really, really helpful, though, when you're thinking about especially the disease, so this is going to be fungus, bacteria, and viral issues, is something we call the disease triangle. It's currently referred to as the disease pyramid because there's a time component of it, but I think triangle is easy because it's easy to think about. So for a disease to occur, and this is true whether it's for you or a plant, you have to have a susceptible host, right? It has to be something that can actually get the disease. You have to have the pathogen present, and you have to have a conducive environment, right? So I could be the susceptible host, common cold could be the pathogen, conducive environment might be I'm real run down and sick and tired, like real tired, and so we have a conducive environment. For a tomato, it might be a tomato plant, a fungal spore, a warm, wet environment. When all 3 of those happen together, that's when you get disease. If you're missing any one of the 3, you won't get disease. So it doesn't matter if the pathogen is sitting on the host forever and ever and ever, if the environment is not right for the pathogen to take hold. Okay, and that's important to remember. The reason this is sometimes referred to as the disease pyramid now is because all 3 of these do have to occur for some amount of time, right? Like it can't just be instantaneous. They have to kind of co-occur for a while, and that's when you actually get the disease taking hold. The major types of pathogens that you'll run into are fungi. This is really a lot of stuff that we run into. These are guys that basically the spore will land on a cell and it will kind of burrow through, start taking over. Bacteria, these are much smaller than fungal spores. They often enter through the stomata even, right? These openings that we talked about, or through wounds. And finally, viruses. I think we've all heard enough about viruses for the last couple of years of our life to last us forever. But one of the things about plant viruses is that they are often spread by vectors. So oftentimes viruses are spread by insects. So the insect is annoying, but it's actually when it pierces in to get some juice or get whatever else it wants, and it leaves a virus behind that's way more annoying. Luckily for us, the overwhelming majority of things you're going to run into on plants are fungi, right? So it's like 70+% of problems that we see are fungal in nature. I would say like the other 70 math. The most of the rest, 25%, are going to be bacterial, and less than 5%, almost vanishingly small, are going to be viral problems. They absolutely do happen, but in general, if I see a disease, I assume it's fungal until I know a reason to think it's something else. Going back to our favorite heartbreakers, tomatoes. There are a number of different fungal diseases of tomatoes that are really helpful because they illustrate kind of what fungal diseases can look like broadly. So we have early blight. This is one that's favored by warm temperatures and moderate to heavy rainfall. See, you can see these sort of brown spots and concentric circles and yellowing and weird things going on with the stem. Late blight, it's favored most by cool, wet weather. It's funny because you would think that would make it an early thing, but it's called late blight. This is where you see all this browning, all this dying out. Septoria leaf spot is another one, right? These are these really clear little spots on the leaves and they give way to yellow around it. And so what I think is really helpful to see about this is that you can have all of these different types of spots, right? You can have yellowing, you can have these bullseye circles of early blight, you can have just browning in general, you can have problems on the stems. And these are all fungal problems. And what they all like water. Okay. They all do better when there's water present, when there's, wow, the sky's just like parted here on, I said water and the sky's parted. Anyway, so they all like water. They all like high humidity, right? And that goes back to this thing again of hot, humid nights are our enemy here. They're our enemy because respiration is running faster, and they're our enemy because fungal diseases take hold. Some other symptoms you might see with fungal diseases that, again, tomatoes illustrate wonderfully. You might see wilt. This is what happens when basically a fungi or a fungus takes hold on a plant and it starts growing up through the vascular tissue, right? So just like you and me, plants have vascular tissue that's transporting all their nutrients and all their liquids. And when it gets blocked up by fungal bodies, then all of a sudden the whole thing is going to wilt out because it just can't transport everything it needs anymore. And you'll walk out and the plant will just be wilted. If you were to cut that open, you would actually see, right, again, this really dark, weird growth in here. And that's those fungal bodies killing or blocking the vascular system. Because diagnosing diseases is hard and confusing, wilt can actually also be caused by a number of bacterial diseases as well. So this is all southern bacterial wilt of tomatoes, right? So obviously this plant's unaffected. These plants got walloped, right? And so that's, if you see wilt, you know, it's always going to be a fungal or a bacterial issue. By the time that the problem is in the vascular tissue, there's nothing that can be done. If I had a plant that looked like this or like this, I would just pull it out, right? Don't mess with it. Don't worry about it. Tomatoes, you're going to try again every year. With our edible crops, we're going to try again every single year. They're basically annuals. Don't get so emotionally tied to any one plant that you're going to let this guy sit here dying, dropping bacterial gunk everywhere, right? Because as that bacteria is reproducing right there in that dying tomato plant, it is also making sure that it's in the soil, that it's everywhere else, so that it's ready for when dinner shows up next year, right? When a new tomato plant shows up next year. So when I ever start seeing wilt, I pull out with, you know, I might water one day to see if it was just a cultural problem. And if it's not a cultural problem, out, right? Don't mess with it. One of the cool things that you can see with bacteria is that oftentimes they are so extremely thick in the stem that if you were to cut that stem and put it in water, you'll see what we call bacterial streaming, where it's just bacteria oozing out the side of it. If you see bacterial streaming, that always means you have bacteria. If you don't see bacterial streaming, that doesn't mean it couldn't be bacteria, right? You'll also see spot, like you'll see for a number of different fungal things. You'll see spots on the leaves, on the fruits, kind of everywhere. This is one that's particularly gnarly looking, pith necrosis, where it actually starts just killing the central part of the bacteria, the vascular system. That's going to cause wilt, that's going to cause browning, that's going to cause really profound problems, right? Bacteria as well, they do better in humidity, right? They do better in hot. They're going to grow more quickly, they're going to reproduce more quickly in hot and humid. Some of the viral diseases you can run into, there's some viral diseases on tomatoes you might run into. There's some on rose, right? Rosette is a viral disorder that is actually spread by a thrips. So it's spread by an insect. Some of the major ones you can run into on tomato that I think are really interesting are tomato spotted wilt virus and also tomato yellow leaf curl. One of the things that will always tell you that it's a virus is when the disease is most present where there is the most active growth, right? So at growing tips and new leaves, those are the worst affected. And that's because, remember, a virus works by basically taking over the plant's own cellular machinery for replication. So it wants to be at the growing tip because that's where the most cellular activity is. So it'll kind of hit there, and then you'll start seeing all these really weird symptoms. A lot of times virus symptoms are very strong distortion, right? So there are brown spots here, but what really catches my eye is this distortion, this curl, all of that kind of stuff, not to be confused with physiological leaf curl, right? So know what you're looking at. You know, if you see something like this, if it's maybe across multiple varieties or something like that, maybe it's a virus. Whereas if it's on one variety and the variety right next to it isn't curling as much, maybe that is physiological leaf curl. This is one you'd have to investigate a little bit more. I'd love to see a sample. But really, what we've seen fungus, bacteria, virus. Typically, when in doubt, you're dealing with a fungus. All three of them do better when it's humid. So for all three of them, there are actually a lot of things you can do with your cultural practices to really reduce how bad things are. One note I do want to make, once a leaf has a spot or once a tomato has a spot, plants aren't like us. You can't go back and heal that, right? But you can sometimes prevent it from showing up on new leaves or prevent more from showing up. Once your leaves have spots or once your leaves are chewed, they have spots. They're chewed. You can't undo the damage that was done. Your goal is then to see if you can prevent future damage. So how do you do that? This is where, again, the disease triangle becomes really, really helpful, because we know that if we can remove any one of these three things, we're not going to have disease, right? So first, let's think about how do you remove a conducive environment? Plant-resistant cultivars. For tomatoes, there are a lot of resistant cultivars. Even for some of our ornamental plants, there are resistant cultivars, right? So there are types of, for example, bee balm is extremely susceptible to something we call powdery mildew. But there are, that would actually remove a susceptible host. I'm sorry. Anyway, move on, roll with me. But yeah, there are bee balms, right, that are less susceptible to powdery mildew. And so by doing that, that works really well. You can make sure you keep water off the leaves. So when you're watering your plants, always water at the base. Don't spray the water all the way over it. It's obviously okay if they get rained on, but everything we can do to keep excess water off the leaves is helpful. We can remove diseased plants and debris, right? Because those are a conducive environment. Just like leaving that tomato plant that has the wilt in, it's just going to be shedding fungi or bacteria back into the soil. The moment you see that dead or diseased tissue, just take it out. Increase airflow. So with our tomato plants, it's really helpful to remove side branches to increase airflow as much as possible. This is true on ornamental plants. This is true on a lot of crops. If you're seeing a lot of fungal problems, it's probably because a lot of hot, humid air is being trapped around the leaves. So if you can kind of go in and selectively prune that guy a little bit to increase airflow through the plant, that will help reduce the amount of disease. Mulch. This is super helpful because a lot of our diseases actually hang out in the soil over the winter. And so what happens is new leaves come out or leaves are out, and it's rain, truly. Rain comes down, hits the soil, bounces back up, carries a little bit of that pathogen with it back up. It's on the bounce, right? And so if instead you mulch, you make it so that rain can never cause the soil to basically bounce up. That's really helpful. It keeps those pathogens in the soil. Yeah, that should have been. Anyway, now we know for next time. The other thing you can do to remove a susceptible host is crop rotation or planting resistant cultivars or species, right? So this is really helpful. Crop rotation is the practice of, if I plant tomatoes here this year, I might plant a non-related species. So okra next year, beans next year, but just not a tomato, a pepper, or an eggplant, because those are all closely related, right? So you're moving through the families of plants. I talk a little bit more about crop rotation in my veggie gardening talk, which I can share a link to after this if folks are interested. But really, this is just about planting resistant cultivars or species in general. There's so much amazing work coming out of breeding labs, both at universities and private labs, where they're developing new varieties all the time. Sometimes plants get a bad rap, tomatoes especially, where it's like, oh, the resistant varieties aren't as tasty. But if we go back to that idea that we talked about in the very beginning about how you have a limited amount of cash, right, or you have a limited amount of energy, when you plant a resistant variety, typically you're asking the plant to invest more in defense. When it invests more in defense, it might invest slightly less in the sugars and acids that make the fruit tasty. That is a trade-off. That's why a lot of our heirloom tomatoes are beautiful and so delicious and so wonderful. And they are also complete wilting violets, right? Like they die at the faintest drop of a hat. And I don't care how good that tomato should have been if I never get to eat it. That's what I don't understand on some level about heirlooms. If you're able to plant multiple plants, plant some of those wonderful, tasty heirlooms, and plant some of the new developed cultivars that in many cases are actually just as tasty, but they're much more disease resistant, right? Plant a balance, okay? Because again, the theoretical vegetable that was going to be so delicious, if you never get to eat it because it dies of disease, what good is it doing you? And then finally, there are ways to knock out the pathogen. And so the way we do that is typically through chemical interventions. And this is the use of various pesticides. In this case, you would be using something like a fungicide, copper sulfate, copper soap. You'll see it named a number of different things. It is organic listed. It works extremely well, especially on young leaves for many things. Read the label. Always, 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 always follow your labels. The label is the law, but they can be very effective. I really like using copper, especially for the undersides of young plant leaves when I'm putting out veggies in the garden. It's very, very effective. Takes out most of your fungal and bacterial problems. But read your labels. Okay, so that's a little bit about diseases. Moving on to insects, friends and foes, as I like to think of them. Fun fact, they're basically all friends, statistically speaking. There's a couple of foes that gives everyone else a bad name, but the vast majority are friends. Right, even this guy, this gnarly rejuvid or assassin bug that's just kind of eating the nymph of something else, which is awesome. Insects are extremely helpful in the garden. Typically, if we have trouble with insects, it's because the garden is out of balance and it's actually not diverse enough. We'll talk about that more. But if you have a good, healthy, diverse ecosystem in your garden, the aphids will show up, yes, but the ladybugs will show up too, and they will eat the aphids, right? You need to be able to support everyone. And when everyone is supported, everyone's in balance. And then the damage from any individual is not that bad. Typically, when we see insect problems, it's because you have a system that's not balanced. And so when a pest takes hold, there is nothing else to come along and eat it, right? So a little bit about plant defenses. This helps us understand insects better. So plants are very, very well defended. They're very well defended. They often have thick cell walls. They have all sorts of defensive compounds. Like, for example, the spiciness of a mustard. Those are actually compounds called glucosinolates that the mustard has evolved because their insect pests can't eat them that well, right? So in the same way that milkweed can only be eaten by monarch because it's toxic, those spicy compounds in mustard are actually the plant's own little version of an insecticide. Nicotine is a plant insecticide. Caffeine is a plant insecticide, right? All of these things that, unfortunately for the plants, we think are delicious are often things that those plants developed as defenses. Obviously, there's also things like spines, thorns, prickles. And so in order for insects to be able to eat plants, those are very, very, very complicated relationships that have to evolve over time, and they can be very intricate. One of my favorite examples is actually from milkweed, right? So as many of you know, monarchs only feed on milkweed as larvae, and you don't tend to see many other insects on milkweed aside from monarchs because, again, milkweed is toxic. what's cool about this, what's really cool about this, is that milkweed is not actually even only toxic. It also has a white sticky sap that will like gum up the little caterpillar mouth parts. And it makes it hard even for monarch caterpillars to eat. And so what they have figured out is not only have they figured out chemically how to not be killed by the toxin, but instead to use it for their own purposes. They have also figured out behaviorally that if they come along and chomp the rib of the milkweed, then that white sticky sap doesn't flow, and then it's easy to eat up here, right? So you'll see this chomped midrib, and then you'll see this is where that little caterpillar was unable to eat because it had stopped the white sticky sap. So why do I say all this? I say this again because these relationships are really complicated. They evolve over a really, really long time. And in the same way that typically diseases do not impact different species, insects don't eat different species of plants, right? So aside from some notable exceptions like locusts, right? For the most part, there are these really close relationships. And so if you see insect damage on a whole bunch of different plants, often that's a whole bunch of different types of insects. So, right, monarchs feed only on milkweeds. And it can change over the course of the life as well. So host specificity. So monarch caterpillars, we eat only milkweeds, but the butterflies will actually feed on a number of different types of plants, right? Because they're getting nectar and they don't care anymore. Some of the exceptions, and these are the ones that can drive us totally nuts as gardeners, are the generalists. So this will be things like grasshoppers, Japanese beetles, some aphids. But even what we think of as some of our like most annoying enemies in the garden, right? Something like tobacco hornworm. Tobacco hornworm, there's a couple of species actually. It's like tobacco hornworm and tomato hornworm, but they all eat solanaceous crops, right? So they eat tobacco, tomato, pepper, and eggplant, and they don't eat other things, right? So you'll see this big fat caterpillar going to town in your tomato, but like there is nothing that's going to get that caterpillar to move to a pea plant. It's not interested, it's not in the group, right? And so that's actually really helpful for us because it means that we know that at least for the most part, Japanese beetles aside, most things are not going to come in and totally overwhelm everything, right? Most problems are going to stay more localized, which is helpful. The other major group of generalists, which we can use to our benefit, are the predators. So many of our predator insects will come in and they'll just go to town on everything. Right? that's really, really helpful. You know, birds will eat every caterpillar, right? Predatory insects will eat so many different things. And so what our goal is often to keep our plants healthy enough that they can defend themselves and then create enough of a rich habitat and a rich ecosystem that the predators, from insects to birds to everything else, are happy and healthy there so that they can come in and kind of, you know, it's like the 1-2 punch, right? And our predators are our friends. So how do you identify which insect might be giving you trouble? They leave dead giveaways, right? So some of the major damage that you might run into, there's feeding damage, right? Everything from the super annoying of eating the center of the stem to feeding on fruits to stippling damage. We'll talk about this a little bit more, where they're actually just pulling out juice. They do nesting and egg laying. This is a gall on a oak tree, right? Which is really cool because actually it was a little wasp or a fly that laid an egg, and then it actually caused this crazy growth for that young to grow up in. And then some diseases. So this is where we see some of our viral diseases coming in, and especially prevalent on some of our fruit trees, where it's actually even things like honeybees that are spreading that viral disease as they kind of go around pollinating, which is super frustrating. One of the easiest ways to identify insects is by the sort of chewing damage that they create. And so something that's helpful to know is that by and large, not all insects can even eat plants or cause chewing damage, but there are a number of them that are pretty distinct. So we see chewing mouth parts. This tends to be on some of our beetles and our caterpillars. Piercing, sucking mouth parts. These are the mark of what we call true bugs or hemiptera. This guy, the assassin bug, the wheel bug, I love him because he likes to pierce and suck other insects. But unfortunately, a lot of them do like to pierce and suck our plants. And so those can cause damage. Sponging mouth parts, this is the mark of the flies. They typically can do some damage, but they're just as likely to do damage by laying eggs and having their maggots grow in the plants than by actually eating them. And then siphoning or chewing, lapping mouth parts. This will be things like bees, butterflies, and that kind of stuff. For the most part, they're not going to be causing too much damage on our plants, right? It's really these ones up here that are causing the vast majority of plant damage. So for chewing mouth parts, you might see damage from leaf feeders, right? These are our caterpillars, right? These are the guys that are going to go along and just go to absolute town on your plants. And you will see, right, literal chewing damage, right? Like that looks like someone took like a little like out. Beetles, both adults and larvae, they can cause a fair bit of chewing damage. Grasshoppers, right? These are kind of our greatest hits. Some of the signs you'll see are chew marks and holes, frass, that's our fancy word for insect poop, and sometimes even webbing. Webbing is from the caterpillars as they're trying to do things. One thing I will note, especially when we're talking about ornamental plants, is that tolerate damage. That's your first line of defense for all of this, is tolerating some amount of damage, especially if you're planting native plants. Because you're actually planting native plants to have this whole ecosystem running. And when the ecosystem is running, you should see the damage because everybody needs to eat, right? And so we'll talk about that in a little bit about how you kind of assess problems, but make sure that you're realistic and you tolerate some of this damage, because I could see this as, you know, terrible evidence of something eating all my plants, or I could see it as, oh, there are caterpillars nearby. That's kind of cool. Like, I wonder what they're doing, right? All about frame. Chewing mouth parts, the leaf miners are a totally different set. These are interesting. I love this. I actually think this is really pretty and really cool. What the leaf miners are doing is they feed between the top and the bottom of the leaf. And so I just think this is so cool, where they think the outermost layer on the top and the outermost layer on the bottom are too tough. And so instead they like to eat just the middle layer because it's the tastiest. So those are the mesophyll layer of cells. They don't eat the epidermal or outer cells. And so they're literally just in there kind of like munching along, right? Just munching. You're seeing the little path where they've basically munched out all the chlorophyllic tissue. They can also do this really cool thing where they cause these, what we call like an edema, or kind of these weird galls. And if you were to crack one of these open on a boxwood, for example, you would see a little grub in there, or a little maggot actually, because these are typically fly larvae, right? So flies have those sponging mouth parts. So flies are not normally causing damage by eating. They're causing damage by laying little maggots that then grow up eating those tender cells. The damage is typically very minor. Again, there's no way to undo this damage. And even then, it's minor. It's, I think, kind of cool looking. If you didn't like the look of these leaves, you could certainly prune them out and that would be fine, right? But there's no sort of chemical intervention for this, really. I don't think you need one, but also knowing that there is a little critter crawling around inside that leaf, it's hard to find chemicals that will actually go all the way through leaves and impact something on the inside, right? Chemicals typically are much more useful if they can make direct contact with the insect than if they have to penetrate a tissue to contact that insect. Leaf skeletonizers, these are our scourge, Japanese beetles. These are critters that will eat the epidermal leaf tissue or leaf tissue except the veins, right? So they'll eat all of that tissue, but they don't like the veins. The veins are too tough. So delicate. They leave the skeleton of leaf remains, which is, if you weren't enraged, quite pretty, actually, and quite interesting looking, with a lace-like appearance. Japanese beetles can be really dastardly. There is just kind of a season for them. We try to get through it as best we can. Some people will use those traps, which kind of attract in Japanese beetles. Those can work if you're super diligent, right? If you're out there emptying that thing every day, good, that can work. If you're not, what's going to happen is it's going to fill up and you're going to be attracting all these Japanese beetles in with this Japanese beetle pheromone, but the trap is full. So now you've attracted them all in and there's nowhere for them to go and die. So instead they're just there for the buffet, right? So be honest with yourself about whether you think you're actually going to be out there emptying that thing every single day, or if instead you're just going to hunker down and try to get through Japanese beetle season as best you can and move on from there. But they can be frustrating. They can be very frustrating, very annoying. There are some chemical controls for them, but because they fly, there's always going to be more. Another set of chewing mouth parts are the borers. These are some that can break your heart, just like the Japanese beetles. So this is typically beetle and moth larvae. They feed under the bark on stem and wood tissue. So this is an example of ambrosia beetles. This is southern pine beetle. So for these ambrosia beetles, we're starting to see this more on crepe myrtle, but we see it on other things as well. You have a little beetle that burrows down into this hole. When these holes were fresh, there was something that looked like a little toothpick sticking out the end. That was all the little sawdust that the beetle had pushed out behind it. The beetle brings with it its own favorite fungus. It doesn't actually eat the plant tissue at all. It just brings that fungus with it, creates a little cavern that it then inoculates with that fungus. It grows the fungus. It's a little fungus farmer, right? And then it lays its eggs, and those grubs, those baby beetles, live on that fungus. So the problem is not actually the fungus, and the problem is not really the beetle. The problem is that it's created a hole and in an environment that a fungus could thrive in. And so as other things come in, secondary things come in, that can cause a problem. But ambrosia beetles and pine beetles, both of those respond to stress hormones, right? So they are more attracted to trees that are stressed out. The other one we're going to run into as vegetable gardeners are the squash vine borer. This is like the worst. Here in the South, we actually have 2 seasons where they can fly. And it's very, very frustrating because they have like a double life cycle here because it's so warm. It comes in, it's a moth that comes in and it lays. I say it's a moth, and every time I say that, I worry that it's actually a beetle. I think it's a moth. I even have it in my notes. Squash vine borer, moth. Okay, good. It's a moth that comes in, lays its little egg right here at the bottom, and then that caterpillar, which you can just see right there, that little caterpillar, grows up, eats out all the vascular tissue, and that squash, you'll come out one day and it will be completely wilted. There's no recovering. No matter how much water you add, it can't be fixed, right? Because it's had basically the core of its vascular tissue eaten out. You can cover your plants while the squash vine borers are flying. If you catch it early enough, you can actually slit the stem open, carve the grub out, and then bind it back up with twine. And oftentimes the plant will grow back together, but it's just very difficult. Some of the signs and symptoms you're going to see of the borers in general are going to be things like sawdust, holes, tunnels, secondary disease, and often death with no treatment. The outcome is death and there's no treatment. Because again, there aren't good insecticides that can go down into the wood and kill things, right? Most insecticides work by having action on the outside. Okay. Moving on from chewing mouth parts into piercing, sucking mouth parts. This is the mark of a true bug. To an entomologist, not all bugs are bugs. Only the hemiptera are bugs. They are the true bugs. So the true bugs have these piercing, sucking mouth parts that can lead to discoloration, stippling, and distortion. So you get discoloration by removing the cells containing chlorophyll. So, right, that's what you would see. Let's see. It's a little bit like this, but this looks more like stippling to me. But basically, they're going in and they are taking out liquids. They are taking out proteins, sugars, everything else that they want by just sucking the liquid out, right? So it's like a little needle. They go in and they pull the liquid out that they want. Stippling are tiny spots, can be leaf bronzing or yellowing. It's like what you're seeing down here. To me, this is also a form of stippling as well. It looks to me like you had a paintbrush, right, with a lighter color on it, and you just kind of were doing that around. That's why they call it stippling. Distortion, you can get this, for example, with aphids or with other things. That's what's going on here. They inject compounds to keep the phloem, which is the plant liquid that carries food and nutrients, flowing, right? Because they want all that liquid, they basically get the plant to keep giving that liquid, which causes distortion and kind of strange growth. A lot of times if you see aphids, for example, on a really young plant, you'll see distorted leaf growth just like this right at the very tip. And that's because they've kind of messed up all the regular liquid flow as those plants were growing. The other thing that very much comes from piercing, sucking mouth parts, and aphids in particular, is honeydew and sooty mold. So honeydew, this is aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, soft-scale, a lot of our true bugs. Basically, these are insects that feed on phloem, which is, like, again, the plant liquid that carries food and nutrients. What happens is that they are sucking out all this liquid, and it has much more sugar than it has protein, but they need a certain amount of protein. So they're going to keep sucking liquid until they get enough protein. And what they do with the extra liquid that they didn't need because it was too much sugar and too much water is they put it out the back, right? They excrete it. And so basically they're causing damage to the plant at the same time as they're dropping sugar water everywhere, right? Because it's the extra. That sugar water is honeydew. It's what we call honeydew. You'll come out and the plants will be sticky, or they might have a lot of ants and wasps on them, a lot of things coming to them. And it's because of all that extra sugar water that's basically appearing from the aphids. If it is there long enough, it then gives rise to sooty mold. This is a fungus that grows on honeydew. It blocks the sunlight. The plants will start looking black like this, right? It's it's sooty looking. So if you ever were to see honeydew, which is the sugary substance, or if you were ever to see this sooty mold, what you know, right, is that you actually have an aphid problem or some sort of thing like an aphid, okay? And what we discussed with one of the questions that was really, spot on was that aphids are most common on stressed plants. Again, so this goes back to our thinking, right? Okay, I have a stressed plant. There's something wrong with the culture of this plant, right? That it's not growing correctly. It's then attracting insects like aphids that then are depositing the honeydew that then the sooty mold is growing on, right? But so what I need to figure out is something like horticultural oil or insecticidal soap can be very effective in knocking out the aphids, which gives me time to figure out why the plant's not happy in the first place. This can also even just be scraped off with your finger or brushed off, right? Because the sooty mold tends to just be very, very surface. All right. So we're wrapping up. We have a couple more slides on insects, but we're going to be wrapping this up. So some of the other problems you can see from insects include egg laying. It's going to be your gall forming insects. These are so cool. Again, I just think this is interesting. There's nothing you can do to undo this. These are more like interesting, wonderful things that you find in the garden just because they look cool. Don't worry about it. Move on. It's a sign of an active ecosystem. Twig girdlers, these are little beetles that their grubs only like to live in dead tissue. So what they do around is they go around, especially on things like pecan, they girdle twigs. So they cut that twig off, it dies, and they have their grub in there. And so they've basically just made a little house. So if you were ever to walk out, especially beneath a pecan or a hickory, and see a bunch of cut twigs and you didn't cut them, you could just throw those away. And that's a really effective way to get rid of kind of the next generation. They really are not causing serious damage. These are just kind of things that happen, right? So a vast majority of insect problems you're going to see are things that happen, especially on our ornamental plants. So this is one of the frustrating ones. This is kind of the only time you'll really see a lot of viral issues is with some of the things that are brought in by pollinators and other things like that, which is like perverse. All these wonderful things you want to attract in, but they're spreading diseases. So for example, tomato spotted wilt virus, it's spread by thrips. It's this sort of disease. They're spread either directly by feeding or indirectly just by wounding. It's hard to prevent this. Fruit tree people, when it comes to things like fire blight and that kind of stuff, you're going to have your own intricate spray schedule. You're going to have your own intricate thing to try and deal with that if you want to try and prevent it. For most of us, this is just something that happens and we kind of move on. The major case that is an exception is going to be rosette disease, which many of you have probably already heard of, where you start seeing too many thorns or prickles on the roses. They start having really weird distorted growth. They start having this, that, and the other. That's a viral disease brought in by thrips. And typically those plants you do just remove. But for the most part, you're not going to see too much of this in the garden. So when it comes to insects, if you create a nice ecosystem, they will come, right? The good part about that is that if you create a nice spot, the pests will come, their predators will come, everybody will come, and what you want is balance. So always consider your options. This is an azalea lace bug. I think these are beautiful. They cause all sorts of stippling damage on azaleas, but they're absolutely beautiful little insects. And typically the damage that they cause is most prevalent on azaleas that are planted with too much sun. So it's a cultural problem first, right? So ask yourself, is an intervention even necessary? Do I really have to do anything about this? And what is the least invasive, still useful option? So some of the options you do have if you need an intervention, again, always start with cultural. So prepare soil to promote healthy root growth. Make sure you have the right plant in the right place, right? Something that wants full sun that you put in the shade or vice versa is always going to struggle. Practice crop rotation. This is really useful because then you don't let problems build up in one spot over time. Interplanting can be very useful. This is a way of, the one case that we have that's really well documented is there are certain types of marigolds that can help with nematode problems. Interplanting is helpful also though too, because instead of planting everything in one spot as a monocrop, you plant species together, and that gives the pests something like less to eat on. And just be aware of your planting dates. So it can be very, very helpful to plant things somewhat early if possible, because they have a lot of chance to grow before it gets super hot and super humid. That's a little bit contentious. There are different schools of thought on that. For mechanical controls, for insects especially, hand picking is always very effective, especially for small batches. It's also good because it gives you time to look at the plants. Barriers. So this can be things like row cover, right? So this, you can actually literally cover the plants when you know there are going to be problematic insects around, right? So for some of our brassicas, it could be, or, you know, like mustards and kales, you could be covering it when cabbage loopers are flying, or for example, with our squash vine borer, covering your squash when you know they're flying, and you can find that information online pretty easily. I love this. Copper is a very effective barrier against slugs. They cannot and will not crawl across copper. Pruning and raking, really removing all that dead and diseased and damaged tissue. Water spray. Swift kick with a hose will knock a lot of things off, including most of your soft-bodied insects like aphids. Another great type of intervention is biological control, right? This is about having that healthy, thriving ecosystem where all the predators show up as well. This is a Japanese beetle with a tiny fly egg on its back. That fly is going to hatch and eat that beetle, right? This is a wasp going after an aphid. Lacewings are going to be predatory insects. This is their little eggs on these pretty little stalks, right? So all of these different things are very effective. One of the chemicals that's quite effective for controlling caterpillars, especially on crop plants or like edible plants, is BT. This is a soil-borne bacteria that was discovered in the 1930s to basically kill all caterpillars. It's organic listed. It's one of our oldest organic controls. BT, often sold as dipple dust or thuricide, Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria. It works really well. The one thing I will absolutely tell you to be careful with, though, is that it kills all caterpillars. It kills monarchs. It kills swallowtails. It kills a tobacco hornworm, right? Like it kills all of it. So I would absolutely only use it where I knew that I didn't want caterpillars, right? On some of my tomatoes and that kind of stuff. Luckily, it does degrade in the environment very quickly, which I like. And that brings us finally to chemical intervention. You absolutely need to know what you're dealing with. So for example, this is a little grub of a ladybug eating an aphid, right? He looks gnarly though. He looks pretty ugly. I mean, you know, a face a mother could love, right? So you would want to know what that was before you went through and just tried to wall up all of these guys because they're all uglies, right? Just be really aware of what you're doing. Time your applications appropriately. Again, this is all stuff that we can help you with through the extension office. We can provide good resources. We can talk you through how to do this. Many things can be handled either with insecticidal soap or with BT, right? What we just talked about, Bacillus thuringiensis. This will take out caterpillars. This will take out most of your other soft-bodied insects. Insecticidal soap would kill those aphids. But most importantly, always, always, always fully read and follow the label. Most important thing, make sure that what you're trying to kill, you know what it is and it's on the label. So kind of a quick set of diagnostics. How serious is the problem? Do I need to do anything? So this depends on the age and size of the plant. So how much of the plant is affected, with younger plants being more vulnerable, right? If a tiny bit is affected, probably don't worry about it. But if a tiny bit or if a large bit on a young plant is affected, maybe that's a problem. If leaves are attacked or leaves are showing damage, that's really not that big of a deal. Most of the time, plant can grow new leaves. But if the stems are being impacted, that's a problem because, right, that's the structure of the plant. Healthy, non-stressed plants are always more resilient. They always do a better job. So if the plant is otherwise healthy and has a little bit of a problem, I would leave it be. Is it an ornamental or an edible plant? We always have a lower tolerance for pests on edible plants because they're typically short-lived and because we really want whatever they were going to make for us. And so finally, will the problem persist over a few weeks or several months, right? So something like Japanese beetles are devastating, but they come in and then kind of they move on after too long, right? And that's really frustrating, as opposed to something that stays for a long time and eats all of the plant, which maybe then you would want to come in with a treatment. And so for the last couple of minutes, we will just kind of quickly go through some of the things you can do to help your plants and how to kind of scout out your problems. So this is bird netting over blueberries, right? Sometimes a mechanical barrier really is what gets the job done. So for all diseases and for all problems, we want to practice what we call integrated pest management, or IPM. There are several major steps to IPM, but really this is an idea of pest management is not one strategy that you implement one time, right? It's an ongoing process that you do. Starts with monitoring and scouting, really knowing your plants, knowing what they look like, knowing when problems show up, right? It's always a good idea every week, at bare minimum every 1 month, to walk through the garden, take a look at all the plants, look at the undersides of the leaves, look down into the plant, see how it's going. You want to catch problems as early as you can. Properly identify both the plant and the problem, right? Many plants have weird things going on, but that's just what they do, right? And so it's helpful to know if it's normal or not. Assess the situation and set thresholds. What do I mean by thresholds? I mean that, for example, a apple farmer has a much higher threshold for how his apples need to look than you do, right? You do not need to be growing apples that are so beautiful and wonderful they could sit on the shelf at whatever fancy grocery, right? You need to grow apples that are like nice and enough and maybe would look good in a pie, right? Like, you know, and so be realistic, right? You have to be able to tolerate some damage. No damage is not a threshold. That's not reasonable. That's not realistic. Perfection is not a threshold, right? I like to think of number 3 alternately as lower your standards. Implement a strategy, starting with the least toxic first, right? So try to figure out how you're going to deal with it culturally before you deal with it chemically, and evaluate your success, right? Come back, figure out how well that actually worked. And so much of this really relies on having and take a notebook and taking notes. This is one of the absolute best tools you're going to have for pest management in your garden and for gardening in general. Writing down what you did, when you did it, and how it worked out is super helpful. And not only does it allow you to kind of like look back and see how things went and what your successes were, but it also allows you to look forward, right? So you can say, oh, okay, June this year, I saw all the Japanese beetles show up. So I should know that like June next year, I need to be aware of that and it'll be coming. A hand lens is super useful. Something with like a 5 to 10x is really all you need. So this is a hand lens, or you could use a little magnifying glass, however you want to use it. It helps you just kind of like look at things more closely and to look at the undersides of leaves for problems or insects or anything else that might be showing up. Pruners, crucial. So much of this is just about removing dead and diseased tissue and opening plants up for better airflow. So your pruners are your best friend. And if you want to go down the route of chemical control, there are select pesticides that are organic, that work well. I say organic not because I have anything against conventional, but because these are relatively low toxicity, they're relatively safe. I certainly do not recommend all organic controls. There are things I would not recommend at all that are considered organic. These are the ones that are if you follow the label, they're less harm, right? So this will be things like copper, insecticidal soap or neem, and of course BT for caterpillars. I think with these 3 things, you can take care of most of your problems. Some of the common solutions that you're going to run into. I love this. Sorry, you'll see why. First, take time to understand the situation. Do a soil test. Make sure it's not just a nutrient problem, right, that's causing all that yellowing. Decrease water or humidity and increase airflow, right? Increase airflow. So make sure that you have enough air flowing through those plants so that the fungus and the bacteria doesn't have as much of a chance to take hold. Prune the plants to open them up to increase airflow. Prune out dead, damaged, or diseased tissue. This is always a good move. Sometimes you'll hear things like, don't prune trees except for in the winter. If it's dead, damaged, or diseased, I don't care if it's a tree or a tomato, you can take it out. Okay. And if it's a vegetable plant and it looks like real rough, take the whole plant out. Take no prisoners on this one. Okay. Be ruthless, because you are not fighting for a single year. You're fighting for the healthier garden in the long term. And whenever you let a diseased plant hang out, especially in your vegetable beds, all it's doing is shedding that virus or that bacteria or that fungus right back into the soil. So tear it out. So identify the cause of your problem and start with the least toxic control, right? Don't just rush in with, very frankly, never use anything like a 7 dust. Never use that. That's actually really harmful for our pollinators, but don't rush in with the atomic option if you could have started with removing diseased tissue and increasing airflow. And most importantly, look somewhere else for a while, right? Look somewhere. This is my number one gardening tip. We get so fixated. We want a solution now. As humans, we work on this time scale of like, I want it fixed now. And typically the plant is like, I'm going to try again next year. This year was not my year. I'm going to drop my leaves and try again next year. Look somewhere else for a while. Give those plants a year to recover. Give them some time. See what's actually going on. Write down what you're seeing in your notebook and then check it later, right? Give it a chance to correct itself. And if the problem persists, that's when you want to come in with a solution. But especially, for example, in the fall, all the leaves will have spots on them. Every single leaf on every single tree will have spots on them. That's fine. They're old leaves. They're about to drop, right? We can move on. We just look somewhere else for a while. And think about what pest-free really means, right? So we have things like Nandina and Loropetalum that don't get any insect damage at all. But that's because they aren't supporting any insects, because nothing can eat them, right? And what we really actually want is we want diverse landscapes that foster so many insects and foster so many different soil and like so many different fungus and bacteria and everything, that they're in balance, right? Because the vast majority of fungus and bacteria that are hanging out in the soil do no harm to our plants at all. They don't even maybe eat our plants. They want nothing to do with them. And so really, when we see these diseases cropping up, we see these pests cropping up, it's because we do not have well-balanced landscapes. We do not have diverse landscapes where everything is kind of working together. We have really barren landscapes, actually, where maybe the plants are not perfectly healthy. And then in the moment they're not perfectly healthy, they can't defend themselves from everything that wants to come in and attack them, right? So the more diverse your landscape is, the more beautiful it is, but also the more well-defended it is and the more resilient it is. Just a fun example of, all the different critters that might show up when you have this diverse landscape and how they're going to be eating each other, they're going to be balancing each other, and they're going to be some of your best friends. So with that, I think we have about reached time. Just want to one more plug for a diverse landscape. I'll take any questions, and yeah, Jess, lay it on me.
Yay. Thank you so much, Ashley. Loved that final point. I know we want to have the most beautiful gardens, but
that is beautiful. Look at that.
No, but I'm saying, I know we want to have
Yeah.
beautiful gardens, and sometimes we need to like shift what that means and understand like it's it's gonna look beautiful even with wild leaf.
Yeah, everything has a season too, right? Like everything has a season, and sometimes the season is past and it starts like we're all tired in August. We're all tired in August. Don't take it out on your plants just because you're tired too. Just look somewhere else for a while.
So we've got a few questions. What is the safest way to dispose of infected plants or plant parts?
I pitch them. I throw them. I literally throw them away. If you had a yard waste bin, like a municipal yard waste bin, you could put it in there. But I don't throw infected tissue into my regular compost because, like, your compost is probably not getting hot enough to kill that. So I literally throw stuff away.
Yeah. And then please share again when insecticidal soap is effective and when a copper treatment should work.
Sure. So they're separate thoughts, right? So copper is most effective for fungus and some bacteria. And so I love doing that, especially when I'm planting new veggies. I like to do, especially on my tomatoes, I do copper on all the leaves. I do copper on the undersides of the leaves. And that's really great that's really great to help prevent fungus from taking hold. Insecticidal soap is what you're going to be using for most of your soft-bodied insects. And that includes things like caterpillars, aphids, any number of different things. The young stages of many true bugs. So, I mean, I feel like between insecticidal soap and copper, especially if my plants were more or less healthy, I could take over the world. There are other things you could do. There are some other chemicals you can use, but those are the two I would always have in my arsenal.
Great. And then is interplanting similar to or the same as companion planting?
It's very similar. So okay, well, let me start with companion planting. In companion planting, a lot of times the notion of companion planting is that certain plants do well together, like they're friends. There's a more scientific term for that than that, but that they benefit each other. Oftentimes you'll find information about companion planting online that frankly, we don't have research to back up. Marigold, we do have research to back up that it can help prevent nematodes. Many of the other companion planting partnerships, there's not good research for. Not to say that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying, I come from a research-based world. That's my perspective. Interplanting would be something like planting things actively together, not necessarily because they directly benefit each other, but because when we don't have a monocrop, when we don't have a monoculture, it is harder for the pests to really go ham quite the same way, right? Because it's not like you have an entire field as far as the eye can see of their exact favorite food. It's like you have a bunch of different things and they actually only wanted to eat that one thing. And so it's harder for their populations to get out of control. So I always like interplanting because it just helps keep the pests down.
Great. For container gardening, does store-bought potting mix generally have a standard pH level?
Yeah, so you'll see all these different potting mixes, but the standard one is going to have that pH that's just under neutral. So it's like that 6.5 to 6.8 range. It's going to be, those media are really engineered for kind of standard plant growth.
And then what's effective for spider mite control? Neem? ?
Neem could work, insecticidal soap could work. Neem is often, you will see it kind of labeled for a number of different things, including sometimes even fungal issues. It's funny because as I say this, there's like a bottle of neem oil right there that I use for stuff, but I do tend to prefer insecticidal soap and copper. I think neem is a little bit of a jack of all trades, which we all know the second part of that saying, master of none, which is apparently apocryphal, and that's not actually how that saying works. But neem works, but in a pinch if you have it. But if I was going to go buy something, I'd buy insecticidal soap.
Great. Well, we're right at time. I don't think we have any more questions. So I'm just going to, how important is or does timing of using insecticide matter regarding the life cycle of the pest? Great question.
Great question. So for things like spider mites, aphids, that kind of stuff, knock it out whenever you can. They're basically soft and squishy and can be impacted all the time. For things like beetles, it can be quite hard because what a beetle eats is often quite different than what a grub eats. So I would, again, it depends on what you're trying to kill and it depends on what the chemical you have is. Read that label. The label is going to tell you how to do it appropriately.
Okay. So, another
yeah,
question.
This one's a heartbreaker.
Oh no, I planted a pepper plant in my raised garden beds 3 weeks ago. It has been chewed to the soil level. Suggestions?
I think this is a great moment for you to go shopping for a pepper plant. So if it's been chewed to the soil level, if it's been chewed right down, he's never going to recover and do a good job. Our veggies, we're asking them to perform at the highest level, and he's had a rough start. So I would say do that. And also, I'd be interested to know what you thought chewed it, like whether it was an insect or a rabbit or something else entirely. If it's a rabbit, you can do an exclusion. If it's an insect, that might be a good time to do something like BT in case it was a caterpillar. But you might need to investigate a little bit more what caused the chewing to figure out what your solution might be. But time to go pepper chopping.
Yeah. Start again. And it's not too late. Not too late to start again.
Not too late.
Not too late at all. Okay. Last call for questions. I'm going to put in another quick plug to reach out to Extension with any questions. They're amazing. Another plug for Library Fest. Come visit us next week to celebrate libraries. And I will be sending out slides, links, a survey sometime next week, because it is Library Fest. Be patient with me. It might take a few more extra days. But yeah, any